We're lucky to have Dr. Julia Sheffler with us today. She's at the College of Medicine Center for Translational Behavioral Science. She is an FSU grad. She got her Ph.D. clinical psychology here at FSU with Natalie Sachs Erickson in 2018. Her research, broadly speaking, involves development and assessment of interventions for mental health problems, and particularly neurocognitive disorders in older adults. Her current research involves assessment of things like adverse childhood experiences on health outcomes across the lifespan, the implementation of an intervention. Let me just admit another person here. Implementation of an intervention for emotion dysregulation in older age, and assessment of the implementation of dietary interventions and preventions for neurocognitive disorders. Her talk today is going to be on lifestyle approaches for intervening on modifiable risks for Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. So let me turn it over to Julia. And keep admitting people here, but feel free to share your screen.
All right, there we go. Wait, can you guys see?
It's coming up.
There we go.
There we go. It's there.
All right, well, thank you all. I'm gonna move your video over to the screen. So if I'm looking over there, I'm looking at you guys.
Okay.
All right, so thank you all for coming today, and hopefully we'll have more who can view this later on. But today I'm going to be talking about some of my current and upcoming projects looking at more lifestyle and behavioral interventions for Alzheimer's disease-related dementia or ADRD prevention. All right, and I have no conflicts of interest to report, and here is some of the funding that has supported the projects I'll be talking about today, including an ISL planning grant that helped get some of this started. On the agenda, I just want to give you guys more of an overview of the background, why I feel like this is such an important topic area. Some of my current work then on nutrition interventions, including some brief proof of concept, as well as a pilot study I've been working on. And then a little bit of future directions, some grants that are under consideration right now. And then there should be plenty of time for questions, hopefully. All right, so first I just want to talk more broadly about why I think lifestyle and behavioral factors are so important for ADRD risk. Research shows that there are approximately 12 modifiable factors that account for at least 40% of ADRD risk. And when you look at these modifiable factors here in this picture, I've highlighted the ones that really you can see are really directly tied to lifestyle and behavior. And I think these findings fit well with a growing literature finding this really close link between heart health and brain health, which really I don't think should be very surprising to most of us, given that there are about 400 miles of capillaries in the human brain, and our brain cells use about 20% of the energy and oxygen carried by our blood. It makes sense then that damage to our blood vessels through cardiovascular and metabolic conditions is going to have direct implications on brain health. And in fact, autopsy studies have actually reported that as many as 80% of individuals with Alzheimer's disease also had cardiovascular disease. And so I think most people easily acknowledge that lifestyle factors are pretty critical to heart health. This picture here is from the American Heart Association's Life's Essential 8, what they view as the most essential components to heart health. But I think a lot of these are underplayed when we think about brain health, even though you can see that there is this pretty substantial overlap between these and our modifiable risks for Alzheimer's and related dementias. And so recent studies have highlighted the potential of lifestyle interventions to help prevent Alzheimer's disease. Many are familiar with the Finnish geriatric intervention study, the FINGER trial, which was one of the first to show that it is possible to prevent cognitive decline using a multi-domain lifestyle intervention among at-risk older adults. And in the original finger trial, which was the first RCT to show this, they actually found that cognition improved by 25% after just 2 years in the intervention group. And this spurred, worldwide, the Worldwide Finger Network, which is many studies across the world that are looking at these multi-domain interventions. And so I think, this kind of highlights the promise of lifestyle interventions, of multi-domain interventions. But one, I think, issue with these is that many of these interventions are pretty complex. They include almost 5 or so actual domains when they are focusing on these different lifestyle domains. Many different clinicians are involved in these studies, which I think has some issues with limiting the scalability and potential implementation of these types of projects, as well as kind of muddying the waters as far as what are the parts of that multi-domain intervention that are really having the effect we want to see. So I do think there is still this need to refine some of these components, to really understand these different domains, to know what's driving that effects, and to think about how we can simplify and make these types of interventions a little more accessible and scalable in the real world. So that's a broad overview. So now I want to focus a little bit more on why I chose to evaluate a more Mediterranean ketogenic type of nutrition for at-risk older adults. And I think this is important just because you see keto out in the news, you see it on newsstands. So it tends to be this hot topic. And I want to try and kind of explain why I think it really could have potential from a scientific basis. And so when I'm talking about ketogenic nutrition, I am talking more about a Mediterranean ketogenic nutrition. So the food pyramid I often show people is something that looks closer to this, where good fats are making up the bulk of the energy, the bulk of the calories that you are consuming, followed by healthy vegetables, low glycemic fruits, berries, where the carbohydrates are really coming more from your vegetables, potentially some beans, legumes in smaller amounts here, then followed by more clean protein, fiber from nuts and seeds, which also are providing healthy fats and some carbs and protein. And then, you see these sweeteners and things at the very smallest amount in this food pyramid. And so this is really kind of what a ketogenic nutrition looks like. Most of your calories are coming from fat, followed by protein, and then the smallest amount are from carbohydrates. And what happens when you make this shift where most of your calories are coming from fat rather than carbohydrates is that your body actually shifts into a state of ketogenesis. And ketogenesis, there is this growing literature that it has impacts on things like glucose metabolism, mitochondrial functioning, and stress, which also happen to be core components of Alzheimer's disease pathology. And I think one of the more straightforward mechanisms is really this glucose metabolism. So you see here a healthy brain, when it is metabolizing glucose, you're seeing that all throughout the entire brain. All of the cells are utilizing glucose to support energy. Whereas as people develop Alzheimer's disease, even in more mild and early stages, the metabolism of energy is seriously declined. So you get this severely, sorry, hopefully my computer keeps going, severely diminished glucose metabolism in this disease, where the brain cells are simply just not able to use glucose, even though it's completely available to them, they are just not able to metabolize it as well. And so ultimately this is leading to cell death and the brain actually shrinking in this disease. And we see reviews of the literature and more, early just basic science studies showing that ketogenesis has benefits not only on providing an alternative fuel, because when your brain shifts to burning fats, it actually is able to still use ketone bodies as a metabolic fuel, even when glucose metabolism declines. And so one of the main arguments for this type of nutrition is that it actually provides your brain cells with an alternate metabolic fuel that is going to remain unchanged as the disease progresses. Other benefits that some of the research has found is improvements in mitochondrial functioning, decreases in cerebrospinal fluid markers of Alzheimer's disease. So that includes things like tau and alpha beta, as well as normalization of insulin signaling and lipid metabolism on a cellular level. And we also see some really promising early clinical trials, which it seems like more and more are coming out each year. A lot of those trials are showing improvements in cognitive scores, so actual improvements in cognitive functioning in individuals with early Alzheimer's, some improvements in mood and pain, as well as some of these same improvements in biomarkers and other health profiles. And so keto has a lot of potential benefits, but of course there are challenges, and some of these challenges are what I address in my research. And so one of the first is that just making this shift from a Western style diet to this more ketogenic ratio is really challenging for a lot of people. One thing we found is that one of the biggest hurdles is people just can't get over this idea that fat can be good for you, that fat can be healthy. And so actually increasing the amount of fat in their diet is a really big initial hurdle to getting started on this type of nutrition. And then there's, of course, the issue of any time someone changes their nutrition, just sticking with it long term can be really challenging. Another issue is, as I mentioned earlier, kind of thinking about magazines where you see it. It's very easy to do this type of nutrition in an unhealthy way. And so a lot of times this is the sort of food that people imagine when they think keto, like beef wrapped in cheese, and maybe there's some vegetables in there, but it's really just a lot of meat and cheese. When really that is not the type of nutrition that is going to promote more positive brain health. And so helping people understand on a deeper level that the fats should look more like this than that is a really important part of this type of diet. And then a final challenge is considering the potential for lowered appetite. So when you make this metabolic shift, the changes in insulin signaling actually reduce the spikes in insulin you might experience throughout the day. And so a lot of people don't get as many cravings. They just don't feel quite as hungry as they normally do. That satiation lasts longer, which can be good if someone is really trying to lose weight. But of course, for older individuals who may have some frailty, who may be at a normal weight already, who aren't trying to lose weight, this can be a potential problem and something that needs to be closely monitored. And so my Mediterranean ketogenic nutrition adherence program, which is quite the mouthful. I think we're going to need to workshop that for next stages. But our program really put this together to address a lot of these challenges. So this is a 6-week group program that first provides education and support in initially understanding macronutrients. So helping people really understand what are fats, carbs, and proteins. How do you begin to track and understand those? Why might it make more sense to track those instead of counting calories, so that you can really develop a deeper understanding of your food and the quality of that food? We also provide education on the importance of fiber, protein, making sure your food is coming from more high quality sources, more whole foods versus more processed foods. And then there is a consideration of micronutrients in here as well. So the vitamins, minerals, all of the other components that food provide that can be really important for brain health. The second part of the program is the more adherent side of things, is providing some of these motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy techniques that are kind of incorporated into this. So the program begins with some goal setting and helping people identify their values, what matters to them, and how making these types of changes may actually help them move closer to those values and goals. We also provide support for problem solving, managing slips in a healthy way, and beginning to help people change their self-talk and the way they view and think about food. And this worksheet here is just an example of sort of how you might walk through this behavioral example of a challenge and alternate perspectives, alternate plans. And so all of this led into our proof of concept, which we developed based on this NIH orbit model. And this is a model for developing behavioral interventions to address chronic diseases. And so the define refine phase really based primarily on prior work as well as some of the interviews we've did with participants to develop a program that we hope addresses all of these challenges and needs with education support, motivational interviewing, CBT. And then from that, we wanted to test this as just an initial proof of concept. And so this study was one of the first we did with the program. It was just a single arm clinical study with a target of 10 participants with possible amnestic cognitive impairment. And I will note this occurred during COVID-19, so there were some modifications to our profile based on that. All right, so the aims of this initial proof of concept were fairly straightforward. We really just wanted to see, will people find this intervention acceptable? Is it feasible to do this in the community? And is our protocol going to work? And then we wanted to see that initial effect on adherence. So on that initial behavioral factor, is this program actually going to help people adhere to a ketogenic type of nutrition? And so our goal was at least 80% of participants getting measurable levels of urine ketone levels. And then lastly, it was too small of a sample to really hope for significance, but we did want to look at least for clinical effects on cognition using the repeatable battery for assessment of neuropsychological status, or the RBANS. And so the program was actually administered by myself, a psychologist, and a nurse practitioner from the community who specializes in functional medicine and has led groups on this type of nutrition in the past. I mentioned here, sessions are devoted to all of those components of education, as well as then split with some of the motivation and CBT components. And for the actual nutrition, we titrate across the 6 weeks so that people's macronutrient ratio slowly shifts into a ketogenic ratio. And so that way people aren't just jumping head into this ketogenic ratio, totally changing their way of eating. It's really a gradual shift across the 6 weeks so that people can both get used to it on an intellectual level, but also to give their body a chance to get used to that shift and increase in fats. And then participants are also receive a workbook that has most of the materials they might need to make this change, including daily recipes, ways of calculating their macronutrients, informational handouts, and the MICBT worksheets. And so just to jump to a summary of the project. So for initial recruitment survey, we had quite a few responses. And from that, we completed in-person screenings based on certain high-risk characteristics that we thought may make someone more likely to have amnestic cognitive impairment. And with those individuals, then we did in-person, fairly excessive diagnostic battery, neuropsychological batteries to diagnose amnestic mild cognitive impairment. We also collected saliva samples to do genetic sequencing for these different genes. Primarily, we were interested, though, in ApoE4. And you can see here the percent of the participants with each allele type. So we had just over 20% had an ApoE4 allele here. And then in our initial protocol, we also wanted to do EEG assessments to see how this type of nutrition might impact changes in ERP, the P300 ERP. However, right after baseline assessments were complete, that was when COVID happened. And so we did have to remove the EEG component of the trial, as well as shift pretty much everything to being online for the follow-up assessments and shifting the intervention to be on Zoom rather than in person. And so with that shift, we actually lost one participant who didn't want to do so. So for the intervention, we ended up with a total N of 9 participants with a pretty good representation for the small sample. And these people completed all of the pre and post assessments. All right, and so these findings are published in the pilot and in the Journal of Pilot and Feasibility Studies, if anyone is interested. So the feasibility of our recruitment protocol, which was a pretty core part of this study, we did find that we needed to make some modifications. So our original goal was to identify individuals who all of them had amnestic mild cognitive impairment, and then we wanted at least half with also at least an ApoE4 allele. There was this issue of there wasn't enough overlap, though, between our individuals with amnestic mild cognitive impairment and an E4 allele, where we weren't able to include as many individuals with ApoE as we had hoped. So that is something that ultimately we are removing for future trials. I will also say that this process of genotyping and identifying that overlap it took quite a bit of time, and I'm not sure that's feasible for future larger trials, although it is, I think, possible with some additional changes in planning in our initial sample. As far as representation, I showed that we did have pretty good representation for this very small sample, but I don't think we have enough representation in our overall population to support a really representative sample for a future trial. So those are things that we are going to need to address moving forward. As far as intervention adherence and retention, so you can see here, this shows people's weekly average ketone levels based on their daily urine ketone levels. And so 8 of the 9 participants clearly showed measurable ketone levels across the 6 weeks. This subject number 2 was the one exception to that. They had a slight increase, but they just didn't quite get there. And then we had 100% of people who began the intervention completed the intervention. So we did have really good retention in this trial. Just a side note for this person, we found through exit interviews, probably one of the main reasons was difficulty in getting enough fat into their diet, that they just weren't quite able to get into that state. We also found pretty positive effects on cognition for this really small sample. And so this is pre-test to post-test just across 6 weeks. And these are 2 different versions of the R-bands. So that helps control some of the testing effects you might expect. But we did see significant improvement for almost all participants across that 6-week span, which was really encouraging. And there was some clear relation here between ketosis level and that change. And then through exit interviews, we did find most people reported really positive experience in the program with improvements in alertness, energy stability. We had 2 individuals with type 2 diabetes who reported a reversion back to normal A1C levels and some general mood improvements. And then we did have some recommendations for ways we could improve and simplify some of the materials. And so this really helped us, kind of restructure the program based on participant feedback for the current pilot trial. And so I'm just going to go ahead and jump to our current feasibility trial. And so this came from this pilot. This is a 2-arm pilot randomized control trial with 60 participants, and we are in the process of wrapping this trial up right now. So I do have some preliminary data to show here. One of the main goals of this pilot was that based on the feedback we received from the proof of concept, we had a lot of really positive feedback about the quality of the nutrition education, just learning about macronutrients, learning about this type of nutrition, and how people found that really beneficial, regardless of whether they were going to stay with this type of nutrition or not. People reported that they felt that they could eat much healthier after this program. And so we feel really confident about the quality of the nutrition education, but we weren't as sure, and participants weren't as sure about how much the MICBT components really added to that. And so part of the goal of this pilot was to really see the difference between a full MICBT program compared to just the Mediterranean ketogenic nutrition information only. So a group that are pretty much identical, except one does not get the MICBT components. It's just education. And we did retain the 6-week virtual group format for this as well. So our primary aim was to really assess the feasibility and acceptability of our new protocol. Originally, we had hoped to do this as a pragmatic trial through the senior health clinic and collecting electronic health records as our main outcomes. About a quarter of the way into this, though, we realized that we were just not going to be able to recruit enough people from that sole location. And there were also some issues with being able to access the electronic health records that we would need in order to really see changes. And so pretty early in the project, we eliminated a lot of the pragmatic components and shifted to collecting some of our own health information through blood draws and doing our own cardiometabolic assessments. And so that was added into the protocol so we could see that as well. And that helps support our second aim, which is looking at the clinical outcomes related to adherence to this type of nutrition. And then our final aim, which we added based on a small pilot grant we received to look at pain, we added many measures of pain in a smaller portion of our sample to see, does this type of nutrition have effects on pain based on changes in inflammation? And so jumping to results, because so this was structured very similarly to the prior study, but so I'm not going to rehash the methods. And so jumping to the results, you can see here for feasibility, as far as retention, we had really pretty good retention across the study, not quite as good as the proof of concept, but this was over a much longer time span. And so A group here is our MICBT arm, and B is our nutrition education only arm. And so we did end up with better retention in the MICBT group compared to the other. But we haven't quite done the analyses to see, what may be driving some of those effects. So as I mentioned, take all of these findings with a grain of salt. They are preliminary. But we are seeing some potential that the MICBT components add for some people. We also had pretty good retention across both conditions in the study and pretty good session adherence. You see here that individuals in the MICBT group also attended many more of the sessions for those who stayed in the intervention. So that's another potentially encouraging sign as far as adherence and retention for that component. We also generally had pretty good ratings of the quality of the program, the quality of the service based on the client satisfaction questionnaire. Most participants reported it as excellent, and 32% is good, and I think we had one person who reported it as fair, but no negative reviews. For clinical outcomes, again, these are very preliminary, and I've only looked at the overall sample rather than by arm. But we are seeing still a statistically significant improvement from baseline to 6 weeks on the R bands, which I think is encouraging. Hopefully we'll have more information soon on those group differences and looking at that in relation to ketone levels. Similarly, we're still looking at this data for cardiometabolic outcomes. And then lastly, for pain, I was a little surprised actually by how high this number is, because we only recruited about a third of our sample based on reported pain. And so this means that actually a much higher portion of our sample had chronic pain than we even recruited for. And most of them who had pain actually reported some improvement in their pain across the 6 weeks. So this is really encouraging as well. And so that's kind of overall for the initial results. So based on this and some of the exit interviews that we've completed, what I'm thinking for a next step, and this grant is currently under review, is that it seems that some individuals really benefit and enjoy the motivational interviewing and CBT components of this, but there are many people who don't need it. So we saw quite a few people, even in the education only group, who really enjoyed the program, who really benefited from it, and who plan to continue using it. And so it's clear that different people are going to need different levels of support, and may need different levels of care based on their own needs and their own backgrounds with diet, with nutrition, with their weight. And so using a more adaptive trial design may be one of the next steps that we are going to take this, where we're really thinking about, moving those people who respond initially into more of a maintenance right away. And individuals who need that higher level of care would be re-randomized into higher levels of support, including the MICBT components, or just additional sessions as needed. And so this will give us an idea for scalability as well, thinking about, what is the least we can provide to the people who need the least, and the most we can provide to the people who need more. Another step that we are moving toward in a current grant is thinking about how do we help scale up this intervention so that it doesn't need to be led by a psychologist, by licensed providers, and really can be more accessible to anyone in the community. And so another next step that we're thinking about is shifting the protocol and providing that education in a more standardized way, and then providing the supportive components still live, but by a trained community health worker or even a prior participant in the program, so that another older adult could actually be the person leading this and helping others. Other steps we're focusing on are thinking more about mechanisms and some of these related outcomes that we are finding. So other studies that we have under review right now include thinking about some of these outcomes like gut-brain axis, so how this type of nutrition affects the gut microbiota, and how we can begin to look at that in a scaled-up version. And so what I mean by that is thinking about RCTs that are often so controlled that once they are put into a community, we often don't know if they remain as effective. And so one of the next steps that we're considering is how we can assess whether these mechanisms are still happening, whether they're still effective once we scale them up and move them out into more communities. And then a final step that we are moving into is thinking about incorporating this with other important domains of health. So I started by talking about those multi-domain interventions. And so next step is really thoughtfully adding on some of these domains to see whether they are improving the effects that we're seeing, and seeing how we can make sure that, again, those mechanisms and scalability are all part of that consideration as we develop this intervention. And that is all I have for today. So just a thank you to all of my collaborators, my consultants, as well as some of my RAs who have been a major part of the data cleaning through all of this. And I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating presentation. People have some questions.
Hi, Julia, it's Wally. Very, very nice presentation, really interesting series of studies. I was wondering about the cost of this diet. I've seen other types of interventions where they provide some kind of subsidy. They kind of send you olive oil. Was the cost a barrier to any of these participants, and did you help them with the purchases of any of the products?
That's a good question. So we considered that, but ultimately our goal is to make this something that is more accessible. And so one of the talking points throughout the program that I failed to mention was we actually do bring up costs quite a bit as we're talking about what are ways to save costs and eat healthy. Thinking about buying in bulk, freezing, fresh vegetables, freezing whole food so that you can eat them later. That was a pretty consistent focus. We also talk, I have a couple of slides I show on, what are the cheapest but healthiest, like kind of whole foods you can incorporate. Thinking about like eggs are, one of the cheapest, but also best sources of protein and healthy fats. And so we do talk a lot about how can you get these types of foods in a more cost efficient way. But yeah, we don't provide those supplements because I want this to be more scalable. I want this to be something we can figure out a way to do in the community.
Okay, thank you.
Bob, jump in.
So you have found a little bit of trouble initially with the recruitment, and you changed recruitment criteria a little bit, but I'm wondering about the capacity within the Tallahassee broader community for a larger scale study. Would it have to be a multi-site study to get enough people? It seems you're getting a small percentage of the total, which isn't uncommon, but it seemed that was the case here.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we continue to focus on individuals with mild cognitive impairment with this set criteria, we might have to expand beyond. I do think, though, this has good potential as a preventative. And I think if we expand to older middle-aged adults, individuals who have, I think we've talked about that cardiometabolic risks, we're going to be able to identify a much larger sample who would still benefit from this. Some of the future projects, we use the CADE dementia risk score, if others are familiar with that. So it's a measure of your risk in midlife that's been fairly well validated. And so we're using that score as a potential screening criteria rather than mild cognitive impairment, so that we're maybe even catching people before they have developed MCI. But expanding that population further, I think, is going to be how we're going to be able to recruit.
Let me kind of follow up on that last point a little bit, because I see this as having fairly, the particular program and approach is having a fairly broad reach, in the sense that you're right, irrespective of whether or not cardiovascular disease leads directly to dementia of some sort. Cardiovascular disease by itself is the major killer of people in our population. And so it's entirely possible that the program would work very effectively at reducing cardiovascular disease, which has outcomes on mortality as opposed to morbidity in the sense of developing a later dementia. Could you speak a little bit about what you think are the, kind of potential range of targets that you could be going after to improve people's health more broadly, not just cognitive health?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some recent studies comparing this diet to the American Heart Association diet, and it actually outperforms the American Heart Association diet on multiple indices in these early trials again. I would say, though, if we're thinking of a broader impact, it may not be as necessary to get in that ketogenic ratio. That ketogenesis, I think, really clearly has benefits for brain health, for cognitive health, for people at risk for Alzheimer's disease. And it's a strict diet, and I'm not sure that level is necessary in order to target other cardiovascular and metabolic risks. It may be, yes, reducing carbohydrates, emphasizing whole grains, emphasizing, healthier sources of those carbohydrates could be useful, though, to everyone. So it may be a slightly different version of the program that's still focusing more on that low carbohydrate, increasing healthy fats, helping people understand how to do that and how to track that for themselves. But it may not need to be quite as strict of a program. And that is something I've actually talked to some of my collaborators about, is thinking about, what about just taking the nutrition education components and leaving the Mediterranean ketogenic part out, and truly just talking about teaching people how to, evaluate, track macronutrients, what that means, thinking about micronutrients in their diet. Because some of the participants, actually, most of the participants that I've interviewed have really been very positive about, like I mentioned, just learning that part of it. Even though they may not stick with ketogenic nutrition, they do feel really empowered to be able to make healthier choices. And I think, if we can provide that for a larger amount of the population, that would be really great too.
Thanks.
Well, you mentioned part of the progression. You phase them into the full diet, and it seems that that's part of the progression over aging, over the life cycle, because as we get older, we have the cardiometabolic disease risk, which you could do something about, impact at a lower dietary level, you're suggesting. And that would get people more used to this more stricter diet when they become mild cognitively impaired, because otherwise you're going to extend people's life potentially, or quality of life, and you'll have more people get into the cognitively impaired potentially.
This is true. Well, hopefully it's increasing health span and not just lifespan, but
Exactly.
by reducing risk for cardiovascular and all those others that contribute to dementia risk, maybe they don't develop MCI at all.
Right. It would be a good stage-wise. You eventually work them into the ketogenic diet.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Let me ask another question, because one of the focuses that you've adopted is the issue of trying to promote adherence. And generally speaking, or at least my understanding of that literature is, by the time you get to a year, particularly on weight loss types of interventions, things disappear. That is, people stop, they regain all their weight typically within a year, presumably because they've gone back to previous dietary habits. And have you had any thoughts, particularly because let's just stick with the ketogenic aspect of the diet, which is a much more difficult shift than, say, just healthy eating generally, where you might be able to engender weight loss without having to go to the extreme of ketogenesis. Have you given some thought to, because your study interval is about 6 weeks, and you do get fairly good adherence through that point with this particular intervention. But have you given any thoughts to going out a little further, or even just trying to bring people back in after a year to kind of get a sense of what it might take to get people to adhere over an extended period of time?
Definitely. And so I realize I may have left this off, but we actually did bring people back 3 months post for our pilot trial. And we definitely saw a little bit of drop in adherence across that time span. And a big part of that was we actually didn't require, like, we didn't ask people to stay on it. We said, if you'd like to continue this type of nutrition, great, please do. If you've seen benefits from it, we want you to continue to experience those. But if not, we hope you take what you want from this course. And so we did actually see quite a few people who did stick with it because they saw benefits. But quite a few people who were like, oh, I just haven't been as good. I've been traveling, all of the things that normally come up. And one of the things that has come up is an idea for more booster sessions, as well as enhancing the supportive component. So we do have a group, but we don't have a way for them to really interact outside of group. And that was something quite a few people brought up, is it would have been nice if we had a place where we could share recipes or we could talk afterwards, just to kind of get that continued support once the program ends. And I think that is probably, what I'm thinking long term is continuing that ongoing support in some way. So we're kind of still brainstorming whether that looks like more booster sessions, some sort of online forum, an in-person group meeting that is optional. They can kind of come later and continue to meet up. But we're still kind of brainstorming what that could look like. There is the other side of this is keto, I think, has a kind of unique quality in that, as I mentioned, it sort of helps you even your cravings. And so there is some extent where people don't have as many of those cravings once they've been on this for quite some time, but they do have to be on it pretty consistently for a while to experience that. There is also some animal research that shows that once you get into a state of ketosis, you can actually get into it much faster and easier later on. So it might take weeks for you to get it in the first time because it's the first time your body's been in that state in your whole life. But then once you've been there, it's almost like you have this cellular memory and your cells, you remember how to get there faster. And so there's also this potential, and something we emphasize in the program is that, if you fall off, if you stop using it for a few days, that's okay. Just kind of shift back into it, and your body, you're still going to experience benefits of doing this some of the time versus none of the time. And so we do really try to emphasize that moderation and permanent sort of change in thinking, that this isn't a diet. This is just kind of how your food pyramid should look. you know, eat until you're full, eat what you enjoy, but, you know, think about what that new food pyramid instead of the old one.
Okay, thanks. Other
Mhm.
questions? We have lots of time here.
Sorry, I sped through because I thought I was going to go over, and then I short.
No, I appreciate it. And it gives us lots of time to think about it and contribute.
Julia, can you tell me a little bit more about the nature of the intervention? And did you give them recipe books, or did you give them just overall guidance on kind of what their dietary, the structure of that pyramid should look like?
So both.
Okay.
We gave them general instruction, but the goal was to help them fit it into their own lifestyle.
Yeah.
So we did provide them with breakfast, lunch, dinner recipes for throughout the program, but we told them that these were optional. And so people could use them if they needed ideas, but we didn't make that a mandatory requirement. We did have people log their food, so they completed food diaries 3 days a week. And we encourage people to use certain apps as well, like Nutritionix has really good macro counter in it, and they can send it directly to us. So we did have ways of tracking what they actually were eating, but we really wanted to try and give people the information they needed to do it on their own.
Okay. You know, I mean, I think, yeah, that guidance, I was thinking about kind of cultural sensitivity in terms of kind of different racial ethnic groups, different styles of cooking, different preferences. So it just seems like this type of intervention, it's a lot for you to kind of reach a very kind of broad group of people and have them incorporate that into their lives.
Yeah, thinking about that, it's something that came up at AIC this year. I don't know if any of you guys were there, but there was one intervention that specifically looked at developing like a culturally sensitive nutrition program for certain individuals and how we can adapt guidelines to fit, you know, different cultures. And I think that is maybe something we still need to work on to make sure that this fits. In the next version, as we're thinking about scaling up, we do include more focus groups. And so I think that's going to be part of it, is seeing like how can we adapt our current recipes, some of the guidance that we're giving, so that it really can reach a broader audience. Hopefully that grant will be funded. We were scored at a pretty good point, so I'm waiting to hear back from the PO on that, but we'll see.
Well, that's
Thank you.
encouraging. Let me follow up on Wally's question, because one of the tensions I see now in psychology, particularly in the intervention area, is this notion of intervening at the level of the person versus at the level of the society. So the obesity epidemic came on so quickly, broadly, starting in North America, but then spread pretty well around the world, coincident with the availability of, you know, high fat, high carb, in particular, foods, you know, snack foods and all the rest of it. And some people are arguing that the best way to approach things, and particularly if you think in terms of like family structure, so depending on who cooks in the household, either that person has got sufficient power that they can dictate for everybody in that household what the meals will look like. But in most households I'm familiar with, individual differences in preferences and tastes may drive people away from, you know, the goals they might have set if they were just preparing food for themselves. And so part of I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, can simply an intervention at the level of an individual work without taking into account, you know, kind of the household context, and then much more broadly, the societal context?
Yeah, that is a really good point, because one of the main reasons we saw people dropping out was someone in their household was not on board. And they just could not make food just for themselves. You know, they're like, I can't get everyone else to do this, and so I don't really want to do it then. And so there's definitely a clear motivation of, you know, it almost seems like everyone needs to be on the same page, right? They all need the education, that information, or they're not going to be motivated to do it. And you can't just force a whole household to do something. So I think in the future, thinking more about, almost having dyads, pairs, if there's someone else in the household, then they probably need to be a part of the program for someone to do it, or at least a recommended part of it. On a societal level, that's a really good point. There's a lot of changes. There's a lot of issues with food deserts, with access to many of these types of healthy foods. And I don't have the answers to those questions, but I think you're right. I think there has to be some higher level change in the way, and as well as the policies catching up with the science too. Because I mean, the current food pyramid still has, bread is like one of your main sources of food, which is a cheap source of food, but is, probably, like you mentioned, that contributing to, obesity overall, of mainly getting your energy from bread. So there does need to be that sort of societal shift, I think, in how we understand and access food. And on a household level. So I would say that it can definitely work for some people, but there are those other considerations that need to happen. And I'm hoping maybe I can team with a policy person in the future. So if anyone, one of the grants I applied for is an FDOH one, and I know they're very interested in policy change. So if we can show some benefit, maybe that next step can be some policy change.
Yeah, well, good luck fighting the current food industry.
Yeah.
you need a lot of allies for that approach to.
I also see in the chat, Amy asked if we saw any weight loss or gain in the participants. I haven't actually looked at the data we collected on that, but based on the exit interviews, that was one of the biggest reasons people decided to stick with it long term, is they saw weight loss during that time. Mostly that was because some people made that their goal. So that was one of the reasons they wanted to be in the program, was their personal goal was, I want to lose weight. We do try to emphasize in the program, though, that this is not a weight loss program. And so if you follow our recommendations, there's a good chance you won't lose weight, because we are giving you individualized macronutrient recommendations based on people's height, weight, physical activity, age, sex. We actually give that to them every week of, like, this is your goal in grams for fats, proteins, carbs. And so people are allowed to modify that based on their goals, but I think we did see that weight loss in quite a few people. Did that answer your question, Amy? Oh, I guess that was a direct answer. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions for our speaker today? If not, then thank you again, Julia. That was a wonderful presentation. Gives us lots to think about, particularly those of us interested in intervening to promote successful longevity. And I'll put in a little plug for an upcoming speaker on December 15th. We'll have Jeff Kay coming in from Oregon Health Science University. And that'll be the 15th at 3:30 p.m. in the Pepper Auditorium. There'll be more information distributed about that, which will be the very, very last activity in 2022 for ISL. Thanks again, everybody, for coming out.